Good afternoon. This presentation summarizes the findings of the Independent Evaluation Department's thematic evaluation of ADB support for accelerating progress in gender equality from 2016 to 2023. Now, throughout this period, across Asia and the Pacific, there have been significant strides towards gender equality. However, that progress has been uneven and is now slowing. So while setbacks were also exacerbated by crises such as the COVID-19 pandemic, that means achieving Sustainable Development Goal 5, gender equality for all, requires a shift toward more transformative approaches. And that means that approaches that tackle the root causes of inequality and address discriminatory social norms. So it was in this context that IED's evaluation assessed ADB's positioning to deliver effective and potentially transformative support for accelerating progress in gender equality in Asia and the Pacific. So let's look through some of the findings of the evaluation. If we look at ADB's gender policy framework, we found that while ADB's 1998 Gender and Development Policy provided a foundation for its gender equality efforts, that policy has now become outdated, with its emphasis on gender mainstreaming as an end in itself and its primary focus on women without recognizing intersectional perspectives or gender diversity. Conversely, the operational plan for ADB Strategy 2030 Operational Priority 2, that's accelerating progress in gender equality, was a relevant and up-to-date strategy document, closely aligned with SDG 5, and it introduced the concept of intersectionality and the ambitious transformative gender agenda. Although it was less clear on how these specific concepts would be operationalized. Yet, the discrepancy between that 1998 policy and ADB's current operational plan creates confusion and incoherence both internally and with external partners. So when the evaluation looked at gender mainstreaming achievements and challenges, well, in terms of gender mainstreaming, ADB was an early leader among multilateral development banks, having built a deeply institutionalized system for integrating gender objectives into projects and achieving near 100% gender mainstreaming across its operations, far exceeding corporate results framework targets. However, there remain some challenges, notably the quality and depth of gender action plans varied. This is what we found in the evaluations analysis. And there was limited integration of intersectional analysis or approaches that tackle root causes of gender inequality and discriminatory social norms. The other point was that gender mainstream efforts have tended to follow a project-by-project approach, and we found few examples of longer-term strategic programmatic approaches to achieving gender equality outcomes. Nash, I will hand over to you.
So going into ADB's contributions to gender equality outcomes, we see in the evaluation that these contributions are quite significant, but uneven with some challenges in measurement. Many Strategy 2030 projects are still ongoing, and the COVID-19 pandemic diverted resources, making it difficult to fully assess outcomes. ADB stands out among MDBs with its unique at-exit assessment and rating of gender results. However, current M&E systems do not yet fully capture the achievement of gender-transformative outcomes. Across outcome areas, there has been an increased emphasis in supporting women's economic empowerment and addressing gender-based violence. Infrastructure projects have likely reduced women's time poverty, but often such contributions are not measured. There have been modest gains in enhancing women's resilience to external shocks, with initial progress in incorporating gender considerations into climate resilience efforts. Overall, while ADB has demonstrated its commitment to advancing gender equality, gaps remain in achieving transformative outcomes. ADB's gender expertise is highly regarded, but institutional challenges persist. Despite staffing increases, gender specialists are overstretched, particularly in resident missions. There is constrained funding for gender transformative initiatives. Training on transformative approaches and intersectionality is limited, resulting in uneven knowledge and inconsistent application of gender concepts. During the evaluation period, M&E systems have not fully captured gender equality outcomes, transformative change. With the new operating model, this provides an opportunity to better distribute gender expertise across regional departments, but could also risk disconnecting gender expertise from operational teams. Let's now move on to IED's recommendations. The first recommendation concerns modernizing ADB's gender development policy. A new policy should articulate high-level principles aligned with international standards, focusing on contemporary issues like intersectionality and transformative change. Recommendation 2 calls for a revision of gender mainstreaming categorization system and its application. This includes raising the bar for qualifying criteria, distinguishing between direct and indirect gender benefits, and incentivizing meaningful transformative efforts. Recommendation 3 suggests adopting a programmatic approach to higher level and longer term gender equality outcomes by more comprehensively framing gender equality objectives in country and sector level strategies. This requires leveraging CPSs for coordinated efforts. The fourth recommendation calls for strengthening ADB's monitoring and evaluation systems for gender equality, moving beyond quantitative metrics to measure meaningful qualitative changes and integrating findings from impact evaluations to inform future gender actions. And recommendation 5 calls for ADB to invest in training and capacity development to ensure that operations and country staff have sufficient skills in gender analysis and mainstreaming in order to share the responsibility of gender mainstreaming as well. Thank you, and that concludes our presentation.
Right. Thank you, Eoghan. Thank you, Nash. And that clearly sets the context for the discussion that is to follow. But before we get into the panel discussion, let's quickly hear what the resident missions have to say about the report. A quick look at From the Frontlines.
One of the recommendations from this evaluation that really jumped out at me was the value of taking a programmatic approach to gender strategy at both the country level, but also within sectors. And the reason that this one resonated so much is I've really seen the value of that approach here in Mongolia. ADB has been working with Mongolia's National Committee on Gender Equality to set national level frameworks and targets and strategies, but we've also supported the development of several sector-specific gender diagnostics and strategies. And the ministries and agencies that we work with appreciate those sector-specific documents because they provide them with guideposts on how they can contribute to national targets. But they also very clearly articulate the gender challenges within each of the sectors, really providing a valuable resource to ADB project officers who are preparing technical assistance and investment projects.
The Philippines has made strides to advance gender equality and empowering women, now ranking third among Asia-Pacific economies in 2024. As highlighted in the recent IED assessment, significant progress has been made in closing gender gaps in education, health, and employment, as well as integrating gender considerations into disaster risk management. However, challenges linger, including limited access to higher-paying jobs, underrepresentation in leadership positions, and vulnerability to gender-based violence. These are now being addressed in our newly approved country partnership strategy, which prioritizes gender equality as a cross-cutting initiative. For instance, we have the Climate Change Action Plan, which utilizes a comprehensive framework to promote gender equality in climate policy across sectors. We are also increasing women's participation in technical and vocational education through our Business Employment Recovery Program, Subprogram 2, also recently approved. We are committed to bolstering support and addressing key constraints identified in the gender assessment, and we welcome IED's recommendations.
Thanks very much, and thank you all for joining us to this wonderful event. So we're hoping to just follow up this very interesting set of presentations with a conversation about ADB moving forward to address the issues that we all agree confront the ADB and all its developing member countries. So I'm just going to start off with a series of questions to kick off that conversation. And Samantha, let me start with you, if I may. The word transformative was used many times, both in the report and also in the presentations that followed. As you look ahead, what do you see are opportunities for ADB to really take on this transformative agenda, both in its project by project approach to how it engages with countries, but also beyond, as we heard in some of the feedback from the field through its more policy and higher level engagements at the country strategy level?
Okay, thank you, and good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for that question. It's a very big question, but I think that well, first of all, I think we need to see this evaluation and the shift from, I guess, a traditional gender mainstreaming approach to one that focuses more on transformative gender agenda as really part of ADB's journey, because it's not either or. And I think when you look at an evaluation, which has been extremely useful, by the way, it's very easy to focus on what's missing and where you need to go, and that's all valid. But I think it's also important to acknowledge the strong journey that we've taken and the fact that ADB is a leader in this space. So when we talk about transformative gender agenda, sometimes I acknowledge it causes confusion and people don't always understand what we mean. But really, it's about how do we align with, well, first of all, the SDG 5 agenda, which really focuses on the areas that are more transformative in nature. And so for us, it's about how do we go beyond our standard gender mainstreaming approaches to really focus on designs which go above and beyond and address SDG 5 areas and also address social norms. So we're looking about more transformative change that will come out of it. So I think some ways that ADB has already been doing that, and some of these were highlighted in the report, were the ADF thematic pool. I mean, that's been really very significant because it was a dedicated financing window to support project designs which really focus on SDG 5 areas, which were not areas that were traditionally very prominent in ADB programming. And it also came at a time when we were coming out of COVID, and COVID really put a spotlight on some of these they're really perennial gender issues, but not issues that necessarily got attention. So it's gender-based violence, the care economy, women's labor force participation, and we saw the impacts of that. So the timing of ADF 13 and ADF 14 also was very useful for us to sort of really focus on some of those areas. Okay, the challenge is it's only ADF countries. So that raises the question, how do we deal with these kinds of issues in DMCs which are not eligible for concessional, and they're also not necessarily willing to borrow, and that's where we need to be a bit more strategic. And I think it was great to hear Parvit and Shannon, and I hadn't seen that video, so congratulations. It was a really nice video talking about upstream engagement and and that's where you need to really get the policy dialogue going and start linking some of our sort of knowledge work with policy dialogue to build on policy-based lending, for example. And that's where we have been able to do some really innovative lending in a whole range of DMCs. Maybe just one example is around the public financial management and gender responsive budgeting and gender responsive taxation space. It takes a lot of dialogue and conversation, but we're really seeing an uptick in buy-in for these kinds of interventions, and that's also linked to some of the research we've been doing. Like we put out a report on gender responsive taxation a couple of years ago, and with that built in capacity development, and we've seen several DMCs interested to. So those are some ideas, but yeah, I wouldn't see it as, it's definitely not a one size fits all, and it has to be seen in the spectrum of the journey of where we are at as an institution and where every individual DMC and sector and project we're working in fits.
Well, that's great, and it really calls for ADB to continue its innovations as it moves forward in this space. And I think we'll come back again to some of the issues you raised, especially on social norms, which I think is a fairly tricky one to tackle. Ramesh, if I might turn to the other big word that was used a lot in the presentations and in the report is intersectionality. And there, I guess we're thinking about the intersection of various vulnerabilities, of which gender is a very major, but not the only part. You have disabilities and poverty and all the others. And you oversaw from your, I think we were counting earlier, 28 years, was it, of experience here at ADB in dealing with these difficult issues that really have to draw on all the sectors as opposed to any one sector in addressing these cross-cutting issues. So any reflections on this?
Thank you so much, Manny. Before I respond to your question, I wanted to particularly, it's nice to see the Ambassador Wong. Also, particularly personally for me, as I am in my last 2 weeks before leaving ADB, this is a topic, the whole theme, whole agenda, whatever we may call it, is very close to my heart. Some of you may know when I joined ADB, in fact, one of the first things I did was to be a co-author of the China PRC gender assessment. So that's something. And before that, when I did my PhD and so on. Just picking up on or supplementing what Sam said, I think, the gender mainstreaming approach, we are so lucky, we are so fortunate in ADB that the way we do gender mainstreaming, at the end, what appears, if you just look at one number, it is one of those 4 categories that we have. But behind that, in the analysis that we do, which is very comprehensive, there is a lot of intersectionality that comes automatically. And particularly if you're looking at echoing what you said, Manny, when we look at vulnerable segments of the population, it can be in a normal situation in any country. It can be just picking up on what Pavit said in the context of natural disasters. The dynamic nature of how one negative thing or negative outcome affects the other becomes even more apparent. So in the analysis that we do, in the diagnostics that we do, before we come up with what we need to capture through our either investment projects or programmatic policy reform type of operations, we bring in naturally, I would say, a lot of the intersectionality. Let me give you a couple of examples. If you focus on marginalized communities or ethnic minorities, take any country. For example, in Vietnam, when we had done projects in the Northern Highlands, which are also happen to be pretty poor parts of the country, that intersectionality or the multidimensional nature of what is it that you need to look at before you mainstream gender, they come in. And once you address one issue, we also have realized that you start addressing some of the other issues as well. There is, for example, evidence that women in poorer households are likely to be discriminated against, or households with more women if they happen to be in a poor income bracket, the welfare of poor households tends to be lower. This is in certain cultural contexts, as work has shown, which is at least understandable. But what kind of policy measures you need to have in place? You have different types of intersectionalities coming in. Whereas if you have, because of cultural or other factors, if you have discrimination or bias coming in, without no apparent distinction across the income layers, then obviously the measures that you need to put in place will be very, very different. Diagnostics may be similar, but the recommendations or the measures, whether it's in investment projects or in reform opportunities, the solutions become quite different. You can say, for example, take disability. If you take that as a parameter or as a dimension, how do gender dimensions particularly come in? Or more recently, we've been talking quite a bit about in the context of climate change, how heat particularly affects women, or in broader natural disaster context, women are 14 times more likely to die than men. Why is it? What are the specific vulnerabilities they face? So I'm actually, if I look at even from the early days, but particularly over the last about 15 years or so, in terms of implementing our gender approach, we've been learning a lot as we go along and on bringing these multiple dimensions. They're all pretty complex, but I think we've been doing a pretty good job, Manny.
If I've just thank you very much. That's terrific news. But if I might just follow up quickly on that, you sort of oversaw this transition under the NOM to have really stronger sector groups. How did you build in this sense that you really have to have perhaps cross-sectoral solutions to some of these issues at the same time, so sticking to your knitting in these sectors on issues like gender?
Thanks, Manny. A couple of points. One is, NOM is still evolving, particularly in terms of if you're looking at it from a plain vanilla point of view, between the 7 sectors and now 8 sectors with digital coming in as well, how are intersectoral opportunities being identified, how we are bringing. But I think within each of the sectors, or if you take, for example, air quality, if you were to take that as a theme and come up with project opportunities, clearly multiple sectors will be involved in. And if you put in this layer of intersectionality or multi-dimensions to be brought in, clearly we need to look at what kind of interventions are best placed from each sector, like, for example, in human capital, health interventions, or in terms of pollution or environmental sort of mitigation measures that we need to bring in. One live example, we are hoping, keeping fingers crossed, that the energy transition mechanism will be brought to the board soon for approval in the case of Indonesia. What we've done there is to look at how different segments of the population will be affected, and you need solutions from different sectors. So the Just Transition platform that CCSD has put in place is giving us kind of, like a theory of change type of an approach that we can use. Quite confident that as we are learning more in terms of, and by the way, on the just one last point, on the transformative approach, we also need to recognize that the interventions that we are doing in the same sector, they've been assuming a kind of a generational proportion. We are not doing the same type of transport projects or the energy projects. So gender solutions or other kind of inclusive solutions also need to be in proportion or aligned with the complexity that we are facing across these generational changes as well.
No, thanks. Very helpful. Lisa, if I could turn to you, as others and Sam mentioned again, the fact that we do have in place some measures to try to incentivize gender transformation through grants and concessional financing. In your experience, are those enough? Are there other things that we could do to make sure that in the most vulnerable countries that these are being addressed? And maybe if you could also perhaps reflect on what are ways that we can help in those countries that are not, don't have access to such concessions and incentives?
Thank you, Manny. That's another big question. I don't think there's a sort of silver bullet or a magic formula for, I guess, taking the lessons learned from the very significant wins we've had in the concessional finance ADF window and pushing that through into the portfolio sort of approach. But I think I'd probably look at it in two ways. One, I think, and we've heard some of this already, there's some ways and means, I'd call it, some programmatic, and then there's the sort of cultural and contextual environment, and Sam alluded to that in her first answer. So, and I will, I hadn't seen the video either, but music to my ears hearing from Sidi Shannon in Mongolia about what struck her and me was the importance of a stronger programmatic approach that begins and is embedded in the CPS and in the strategies, and then leveraging those successes and pushing them through from the concessional work into the broader portfolio. I think it creates, you might say, the conditions and I think the appetite for individual pipeline project design to be able to incorporate or have a go at incorporating some of the gender measures. Gender analysis and diagnostics, really critical to project design across the whole suite, whether it's concessional or non-concessional. Ambassador Wong's not with us anymore, but it would have been music to her ears. We talk at the board a lot and have a lot of asks around diagnostics. So, and I know we're going a long way to collecting that information, but it's really important to help the teams identify what the impact will be and what the opportunities are. PA and capacity building, I think, is really critical. We've definitely found that in our ADF member countries and our DMCs. It helps the project developers understand the issues. It helps the teams, I think, be better informed about how to integrate gender considerations into their work. We know from your evaluation that we've also heard from partner governments a need to better understand gender issues. So the capability building also goes back into the partner government system to build and shape. Sometimes it's building from the ground, sometimes it's just shaping their understanding of what's possible. We certainly know that it's very important, the capability building piece, where gender inequality is heavily entrenched and where local capacity is limited. And to be fair, that isn't just in DMCs. The gender inequality entrenchment is also a fact in many of our UMICs. So I think that's something that is shared across. We do know that no country is on track for SDG 5. In fact, we're way, way, way off. And I think, therefore, we also know that we have to work with that. The only way we're going to get there is to work with others. So I think the ADB value proposition around RCI and collaboration, I think, comes into its own. I think working with others, with other donors, with other countries, with civil society is a very big part of making our approach stronger. The partnerships don't just bring the resources and the expertise. The other important thing they bring, I think, is the knowledge sharing and the learning, which is, I think, where we can interplay from the concessional space into to other potential lenders, looking at what works and what doesn't. There are some things, I think, that we can share back and replicate. There are some things that don't fit, and we have to ideate and innovate a bit in order to get it to fit. And then the other piece I mentioned was the sort of culture context piece, and Sam alluded to this. It's really important that we adapt our gender work to context, particularly in fragile conflict and violent settings, and particularly to the particular demographics and populations of the country and environment we're working in. And that goes for all of our partner countries. We know in the Pacific, for example, that it's very important to understand and work with the cultures and the traditions in the Pacific, and they vary from country to country. So it's not, again, a one size fits all across the Pacific. It's a very complex piece. We also know from our work that the importance of supporting locally informed, locally led conversations and programs, and to use what we call a Pacific-centric approach. You hear about the differentiated approach, but I actually think you can almost apply that to every country in the gender space. I think engaging local communities, we know, particularly women and marginalised groups, is really critical for really finessing and honing your gender approach so that it's relevant and effective. And finally, I think involving community members in the project planning, in the decision-making process, ensures that you get local voices and local needs met and addressed. So those are some of the learnings.
Oh, that's great. So especially this issue that you raised about the importance of local context is something that, Sam, you alluded to earlier about really, in the end, if we want transformative outcomes, perhaps in many countries, you need to change social norms that are fairly well entrenched. So my question, Sam, if I might, is, and maybe to you as well, Lisa, given your experience, are there any examples where an outside agency like ADB has been successful in engaging in countries to change these sometimes deeply set social norms? And what can we do, and what are the limitations?
Yeah, if I may, before answering that, can I just supplement a little bit back? So I think it's, in terms of how ADB has got to where we are at, and a little bit, it touches on some of the comments that you found in the evaluation about resources and staffing and all that. I mean, I think that ADB has actually done really well, considering that we've had quite lean resources allocated to gender equality. I mean, for example, we haven't had a trust fund for probably the past 10 years. And all this sort of innovative work is reliant on, well, ADF1, but aside from that, it's really just reliant on the usual business process. So that's actually quite challenging. And I think if we compare us to most other MDBs, they have had trust funds but haven't been able to achieve. So I think how have we done that? I think a lot of it has been as baking it into our business process. And I think that's really been our strength, the institutional systems. It really is part of our DNA. And, I guess touching on what Ramesh was saying, we have gender specialists on every team, on pretty much every project team and every deal team. And that's how you get that cross-thematic, cross-sectoral. And with the norm, also the Gender Equality Division has been able to, for the first time, actually directly process. So we had 2 projects last year that we directly processed in collaboration with, obviously, the sectors group, but where actually you had gender specialists as a team leader. So I think that if we want to think about how can we actually get more strength and drive beyond this approach, particularly in countries that are not eligible for ADF, it really is about having TA resources or dedicated resources which allow us to innovate, because you need to innovate before you can really bake it into the core operations. So going back to your question on social norms, it's gender analysis in itself, if it's done well, should look at social norms. It's just that it's a bit harder because, when you're looking at gender analysis, you're always looking at interrelationships and roles and how do you sort of balance things in a more equal way. It's just that I think now we have better understanding and we're trying to tackle it in a more strategic way. So maybe I think about a couple examples. One is obviously in the gender-based violence space, because clearly you can't address gender-based violence if you don't address the majority, not all, but the majority of perpetrators' attitudes, which tend to be male. So we are doing that and we saw Shannon talking, we're doing that in Mongolia at the moment by, we have a survey of male attitudes to violence, which is coming up with really, really interesting findings. And we plan to use that in a follow-up project around addressing gender-based violence in Mongolia. So that's one. I think understanding the other side of the coin and addressing, you're not gonna be able to address the gender issue unless you address them both sides of the equation and really understand attitudes. And I think another area, concrete areas, is in the space of care economy. Because I think we are having increasing understanding that one of the biggest barriers to women's labour force participation is the care challenge. So unless you integrate policy measures or awareness programs or designs baked into projects which actually encourage men to take up more of that care role, you're not going to be able to fix the problem. So those are 2 examples where social norms are trying to be addressed, and hopefully that's helpful.
Thanks. No, Lisa, if I could turn to you, but also to warn the audience that we'll have just a couple of more points. But if you have questions, we'll make sure that we have about at least 10, 15 minutes to address them. So Lisa, any reflections on your side?
I was probably going to talk to the Pacific again. Part of it is probably using my Australian bilateral aid program prior to coming to ADB, and a lot of the work we've done with ADB over the years. I think the gender-based violence work and some of the core program work in the Pacific has been incredibly successful. We know from the work we've done is, again, it's about thinking about the culture and the context and the traditions. One of, I think, the successes has been to, you might call it, looking for the cultural hooks to promote gender equality and to get success. in many Pacific cultures, as I'm sure many of you know, relationships and cooperation are very important. So leaning in on that, and then I suppose thinking about shared leadership between men and women on an issue. So rather than just working with women on gender-based violence and some of the really hard-edged problems, thinking about working with the whole community, but particularly with men and women together in a sort of co-leadership, co-solution. I mean, it'll never be even, but it's the best way of tackling it by leaning into the social dimensions of where it operates, and that will be different in every country. And I think that's been a winner.
No, thanks. Ramesh, I mean, some of these issues, of course, would be quite innovative in terms of trying to experiment with different ways in which we're changing how people behave. And you heard in the report that there's really a call for more monitoring and evaluation and better done. Again, based on your work with the sectors in the past couple of years, what are some of the things that are being done to make sure that we're doing our M&E that much better to address some of these issues?
Thanks, Manny. Before that, just a very quick point on your earlier question on transformative changes that we brought about. I think a policy reform engagement through policy-based loans, I would certainly cite that. Number of countries actually, looking at Yurendra, Sona from your own AD team who've done a lot of work, very clearly shows that the changes that we bring about are lasting. Usually policy reversals do take place sometimes, but usually, I would say 95% of the policies that we put in place stay because we do continuously monitor them through post-program monitoring framework. It can be in job markets or particularly having greater voice for women in local level budgeting. It's been immensely helpful. In the case of Philippines, for example, the community-driven development programs that we've supported through the Kalahi SIDS, which is not a policy reform engagement, but a programmatic engagement, where there was a large program we went in and started supporting. And through our gender mainstreaming requirements, we brought about lasting changes, which are continuing to date after about 25, 28 years or so. On monitoring and evaluation, this is certainly an ongoing process as projects become more and more complex. Clearly, how much time we put in the design and monitoring framework, so its quality at entry becomes very, very important. Actually, in fact, one of the things that picking up from the annual evaluation review with sustainability ratings declining, in fact, that then showed us in early stages of project design. In fact, coincidentally, tomorrow there'll be an IBS on operations, and we are preparing ourselves for in terms of what measures we are putting in place. Number one, I think the resources that we are putting in for project preparation, whether it's through the small expenditure financing facility or the project preparation grants, they certainly need to be directed in having better quality monitoring and evaluation frameworks, in addition to design features that we bring in. The second is actually, more strengthening what we already have in place. So it's one thing to come up with a certain categorization for gender at the time of entry. But as you know, we continuously monitor this through the implementation of the project. And sometimes the categorizations change. And we do have assessments coming from the gender team that particularly if those changes are taking place, we do need to document that very clearly and justify, can we still keep the original rating, or we kind of go for a revised downgraded rating. So that is something we are looking at as well. Although luckily so far, such changes have been, few, but they do happen. The third is overall, project readiness. It's very, very important. One thing is quality in terms of design, but translating that into clear procurement outcomes, and particularly the point that Lisa mentioned, capacity building for particularly executing and implementing agencies. Are we making sure that they are adequately, staffed and capacitated and so on, needs to be looked at as part of project readiness as well.
Thanks. And I guess that points to what Sammy alluded to earlier, how to bake all of these issues into our business processes, not just in preparation of projects, but even in implementation.
I just supplement briefly what Ramesh was saying. So I think there's a few things. So We are the only MDB that has an at-exit gender results target at the moment. I think World Bank is introducing one. So that in itself means we have to monitor our gender performance, at least what we've committed to. So I think that's a strength. Of course, it depends on the quality of the design and what's in the original design and monitoring framework and gender action plan. And that's where I think our new corporate results framework is raising our it's challenging us to put more meaningful and more transformative gender designs to qualify for the different categories. So that's deliberately not easy so that we can lift our bar. And then I think just to say that we're also developing a gender equality management monitoring system, which is an IT solution which will bring efficiencies and hopefully enable us to track in a much more, real-time basis what our gender results are for any given project or aggregated up country or sector, etc.
Great, thanks. Thank you. Let me now turn to see whether there are any either online or here in Manila questions, and if you could identify yourself and identify if you want any particular person in the panel to answer your question.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Khadija. I'm actually new at ADB with academic background. So perhaps I would appreciate if Samantha agreed to answer my questions, or Ramesh. For me, the operationalizing intersectionality was very interesting. Academically, I know kind of what it means. I mean, knowing that intersectionality could also means multi layers of privileges that one have and impacts our experiences in daily life. So I wanted to know, in trying to operationalize intersectionality, have you tried to target not marginalized, but perhaps privileged communities? It could be in line with targeting men when we are trying to improve women's situation. So it was out of curiosity, just because I'm new. I would appreciate your insight on this. Thank you.
Sam, then Ramesh.
Thank you. Yeah, so I think trying to answer. So I think this is an area where we are learning. I mean, again, as Eoghan said, it has been in our previous strategy plan. We've articulated the commitment to intersectionality. But I don't, it's not to say that we never did that before either. It really, as Ramesh said, it really depended. It should really come from a good gender analysis at project level, and a good gender analysis should not treat women and men as homogenous groups. So you should be able to look at that. But to the extent to which we've done that, I mean, there are various examples, and I think we've probably done it better, for example, looking at ethnicity and gender, because when we're working and looking at poverty level and gender, we've probably done that better than we have looking at other types of difference, such as disability is maybe newer, where we're starting to do that. And obviously looking at sexual orientation and gender identity is also newer. So I think it's a spectrum. One of the challenges is sometimes the level of data that's available, the level of disaggregated data that actually allows us to work with that particular issue. But there are definitely examples across our various operations where we have brought issues together. I mean, off the top of my head. So, for example, we've been supporting the Laos Statistical Agency to collect various forms of intersectional data, because that was recognized. But that's actually through a TA. I think we've got in some of our project designs, we've definitely got things that look at ethnicity and gender together, starting in disability. It's newer. And on the men issue, yes, we have done that. We've done that in some areas where there's gender-based violence involved. We've also done that in some education projects where we know that boys are. So in that, I'm not sure if I would say they are privileged groups, because based on the gender analysis, they are the ones where the need is, and that's the basis for which we do the design. Do you want to supplement, Ramesh?
Just two points, one general point and one specific example. In the the background analysis, we do take the counterfactuals or the why not type of questions or issues into account. The local level budgeting case that I mentioned, Mongolia is a specific case in point where we've done extensive local level public sector financial management reforms, and we've gone into every sector because the legal framework that they were adopting, went across all sectors. So there we had looked at, communities or households with and without resources, and how certain types of policies or the measures that we are putting in place would differentially impact. But these sorts of interventions, they're better done at a project level. You can put in like policy enablers or legal regulatory type of requirements. But if you're targeting something that you see as an issue that needs to be addressed, for example, privileged communities, privileged segments of the population, men or women, will be getting disproportionate resources. How do we address it? So that's a generic point as well as an example. One case that comes to mind, I was just thinking about privileged communities in Pakistan. We've done a lot of energy sector restructuring work, and particularly we've looked at, as part of the background analysis for debt restructuring in the sector, how do privileged versus others are affected because of the measures that we are putting in place. And there we have looked at gender dimensions as well. But I don't recall immediately in terms of what investment components we put in place. We certainly provided technical assistance, which is actually very helpful in understanding how these differential impacts are being felt, because it was a long-standing engagement that we had. But I can be in touch with you, and I can share contacts of colleagues as well.
Thanks. Other questions and or comments from the floor? As you're thinking, Lisa, I was wondering if you could reflect on both. I think Sam and Ramesh made the point that ADB has been innovative in going beyond projects and looking at the policy and regulatory environment, including through PBLs and other things. And I was wondering, from the board point of view, I know that for some board members, they're all for policy-based loans. Others are a little bit more hesitant and prefer investment-type operations. And what do you see what is your opinion on the mechanisms by which ADB could engage at these higher levels that go beyond project financing?
I think there's pretty broad base support for the PBLs across the board. I think there's a place for the RBLs if you need some points at which you have to hold a partner or a client, help them hold themselves to account in order to be able to deliver. But otherwise, I think PBLs, as I think we were saying, if it's very programmatic oriented and it's you bake it in at the project level and you've got it right, then I think the PBL and the right combination with the TA support and the capacity building is a very strong formula. And I would definitely, we were talking about good practice examples. I think ADB's reputation and what we've achieved in the public sector finance support work has been fantastic. It's a very powerful way, I think, in a lot of our partner countries to advance gender equality through, fiscal policy and sector strategies, budget maintenance. I think gender budgeting is a really good channel to potentially open up M&E into the qualitative space because we're going to get different sort of results and a bit more depth than we have before. And certainly we know amongst our DMCs there is often really structural limitations to what they can do with gender. They've often got fiscal constraints in terms of service delivery and debt burdens. So I think in the concessional space, crafting that public finance work around that's really good. But then in the other countries, I think the PBL has served us very well.
No, thanks. And I guess I think our lesson from the PBLs is that it's really important to ensure that those are grounded in terms of good diagnostics to understand what the policy constraints are. And I know, Sam, you raised the point that TA is really necessary for this kind of work. Ramesh, again, from your experience in operations, I know there's been some concerns that the amount of TA may not be as generous as it's been in the past, shall we say? And what are some of the things that we can do to ensure that that kind of resources for knowledge are there to undertake some of these innovative tools, especially in the diagnostic sides, for which countries may not always be willing to borrow?
Yeah, well, TA resources have always been seen as inadequate, but I think particularly now with the capital adequacy framework update, expanding operations, increasing complexity of operations, and if you use again the generational language, like the second or the third generational type of projects that we are doing will require certainly more sources. But the TA policy review will be presented to the board soon. It's got some measures, recommendations. What we are doing in a practical sense is to clearly there'll be limitations. But what we are doing is to mobilize as much co-financing as possible. So one concrete measure that we put in place is when you go for a large number of small TAs, if you go to other development partners, they may not find it attractive because each single TA will have its own impact, but we cannot create like an overall bigger picture impact in a bigger sense, or we will not be able to communicate that well. So we are adopting a more one may call it a programmatic type of approach. Common objectives like, for example, norm implementation, achieving the 4 shifts and combine that with the capital utilization plan will require innovative investment ideas coming in. And clearly, if you're in the context of, how do we bring in gender dimensions would also be quite complex. So the storyline that we are putting is we will do a large enough TA and we will go to development partners. In fact, we are talking to DFAT as well as some of the other partners to put resources in that overall framework. So we need to be more innovative. Now, will countries borrow? I think, when it comes to, if we make a proposition that it'll improve project quality and the sustainability of the interventions, countries are willing to borrow. Like, for example, Philippines, they borrowed for project preparation, and as part of much of our gender analysis, the social impact analysis, it's all being done through that large assistance that we are providing.
Lisa, please.
On the TA front, I think it is coming to the board. The look at the new policy, so it's a live discussion. But I think there is increasingly for all MDB institutions a consideration around how actively and how much TA is dedicated directly to supporting how successful we can make the project be, but also to TA that goes to, and this is perfect for gender, is more widely supporting the wider development outcomes for the country as a whole, and the leave behind with partner governments. And you showed in your evaluation that many of our client governments, it's about, increasing their interest and attracting them to gender and then shaping the space and helping them understand the opportunities. So the wider leave behind from TA, which I know is not an easy thing to snare, but it's increasingly, I think, dovetailing those two aspects of TA is going to be the challenge ahead.
Samantha, any last words from you, which must be music to your ears to hear this call for more resources?
Well, I think we're probably at time, but maybe just one last general comment. I think that what the evaluation makes very clear is that gender equality at ADB is everyone's business. And, of course, the gender equality team is here to support you, but some of those recommendations require a sort of bank-wide approach. So maybe just to put that out there. Thanks.
Oh, thank you very much. Ramesh.
I think here is where in making a case for larger resources and getting support from other co-financing partners, intersectionality will matter a lot. How do we amplify that? Take disaster risk management, clearly differentiated impacts on vulnerable segments of the population, particularly women, heat, stress, and gender. How do we kind of clearly bring out the impact out, and what is it that we can support, and how do we present an overall kind of programmatic approach will be quite critical.
Yeah, and I think the NOMS solutions approach is exactly trying to do that. So we look forward to more progress as we go forward. So with that, we've had a very spirited and very interesting discussion. Please join me in thanking our panel and how ADB will move ahead in gender equality.